Anthony Fletcher, recently turned 25 years old, and in his understanding, it was the best stage in life when you were young and full of energy. Feelings always come first, overshadowing reason and common sense. The guy's mother died when he was 7 years old. Anthony did not have a father, and his grandfather Harold Fletcher always felt heartache remembering this sad fact. He himself, being a smart and far-sighted man, worked for a long time in the field of information technology. Harold always had money. At the same time, he knew better than anyone else that it was not worth spending savings thoughtlessly and immediately, but it should be invested in the development of something profitable. Therefore, having felt a business stricken himself, he was one of the first in the city to open a small company selling computer equipment. Then, when the business began to bring tangible income, the aspiring businessman founded a couple more similar companies, which eventually turned his business into a thriving business. Now, Harold Fletcher already owned a whole network of companies aimed at selling computer equipment. At the same time, not feeling the need for funds, the old man was afraid more than anything in the world that Anthony would not fall into the clutches of one of the scums, which, in his opinion, flocked to the handsome rich man like flies to honey. After all, Anthony was a very wealthy groom, and marriage with him could be an extremely profitable match for any girl, and this meant that it was not worth rushing to the wedding. "These cunning girls only think how to get their hands on our capital," the elderly businessman thought to himself. Time passed, and Anthony was still lonely. Of course, love periodically broke out in his life, but to the great disappointment of Harold Fletcher, they did not lead to anything serious. One day, Anthony went to his favorite cafe to drink some coffee. Cheeseburgers were always perfectly cooked here, and it was possible to sit comfortably in a cozy atmosphere. Few people knew that it was not the only thing that attracted Guy in such an institution. The fact was that Anthony had been attracted to a young waitress for a long time. He often smiled at this pretty girl, and whenever possible tried to leave her as many tips as possible. At the same time, the young people did not know each other, but when they met, they invariably greeted each other with a nod of the head and a friendly smile. It was difficult not to notice Anthony in such a situation, because he drank coffee in this cafe almost every morning. Tired of uncertainty, the young millionaire found out that the girl's name was Rachel Adams. When Anthony saw Rachel, his heart stopped with tenderness, and it seemed to him that he had been in love with this girl for a long time. Of course, Anthony had repeatedly wanted to ask Rachel out, but every time, something stopped him. Perhaps it was his natural timidity in communicating with female sex. Or maybe the moment was not the most appropriate. Couple of times, Anthony even bought bouquets of white roses, but unable to overcome internal doubts and worries, he threw them into the trash in front of cafe. But one day he decided to ask the girl on a date. The relationship as quickly started, and they became a couple. Anthony realized more and more that Rachel was the girl he wanted to spend his whole life with. Realizing how serious this step is, the guy decided to consult with his grandfather, with whom he always consulted, fully trusting his wisdom and life experience. It is worth noting that Harold Fletcher took his grandson's words very seriously. "I'll tell you what, Anthony. I see that you really like this girl, and this is already good. But in order to make sure of the sincerity of her feelings, a kind of test is needed," suggested Harold Fletcher. "What kind of test? What are you talking about, Grandpa?" Anthony asks excitedly. "Pretend to be poor, grandson. And even better, appear in front of your chosen one in the image of a disabled person. That's when you will see how she will act and how she will show herself in the future. Because it's easy to fall in love with a millionaire, but to fall in love with a disabled beggar is quite another matter," the elderly man added. "Geez, I would never have thought of such a thing," Anthony exclaimed in surprise. Inspired by the idea of his grandfather, the guy decided not to put things on hold and started implementing his plan. He first bought worn-out clothes and old shoes at a sale. He did not forget about the wheelchair, which was supposed to be a key element in his plan. Anthony stopped coming to the cafe and didn't call Rachel for a month. The girl called him many times, but the phone was turned off. Rachel thought Anthony had left her and was very offended by his behavior. When Anthony drove into the cafe in a wheelchair, Rachel dropped the tray from her hands. Glasses and plate with food shattered. Yes, Rachel. I was in a car accident. While I was in a hospital, my company, thanks to competitors, went bankrupt. That's the kind of bad news I have. Anthony replied, lowering his eyes in embarrassment. If you want moving with me, it will be easier together, Rachel offered, embarrassed by her own frankness. A lump instantly formed in Anthony's throat, and Cat scratched at his soul. Thank you, but it would be better if you came to live with me. I'm renting an old house on outskirts of the city. You will definitely like it, and there is more space in it. Anthony made a reciprocal offer. Wrinkling her forehead, the girl thought for a minute, and then agreed. The first dinner together went well and with confidence. It could have been considered romantic if not for the bitter taste in Anthony's soul. The guy was very ashamed of the fact that he pretends to be disabled, but despite this, he had to play his role to the end. Rachel didn't suspect anything, even when Anthony began to slowly move around the house leaning on crutches. It's good. There is a chance for healing, and you can be helped, Rachel exclaimed joyfully. Yes, but the operation costs a lot of money, and I'm poor now. The guy answered, hiding his eyes. Honey, we can do it, and I'm ready to work harder to save up for your surgery faster. The girl reassured the guy. To Anthony's surprise, Rachel turned out to be a very sincere and sympathetic girl. Despite the fact that the guy was disabled, she never allowed herself to reproach him for something or humiliate him. On the contrary, she tried to buy him something out of clothes and cook delicious for dinner. Time passed. The young people lived together for a month, which seemed to them the happiest in their lives. Rachel loved Anthony and was ready to go to the end of the earth with her loved one, and this despite the fact that he could only move around on a wheelchair. Of course, the feelings of the young people were mutual. Anthony several times wanted to tell the girl the truth, but each time he pulled himself together, remembering the promise given to his grandfather. It was getting close to the wedding, and like any exemplary grandson, Anthony decided to introduce Harold Fletcher to his fiancée. The meeting took place in a cafe, where Rachel used to work. Mr. Fletcher deliberately dressed poor, and therefore, the grandson's fiancée did not suspect the trick. In conversation, the far-sighted old man asked Rachel various tricky questions, but the girl, given answers to them, finally won him over. Only now, Anthony was finally able to breathe freely. Young people were waiting wedding day with great impatience. Rachel couldn't wait to become a spouse to a loved one, and her fiancé was eager to get rid of the wheelchair as soon as possible. Time dragged on very slowly, but the young people spent it in pleasant chores related to the preparation of the upcoming holiday. The ceremony itself was held modestly, since there were few relatives on both sides. After exchanging rings, the young people sealed the union with a tender kiss. At that moment, Anthony got up from his wheelchair and, looking Rachel in the eyes, said, My beloved, I understand the absurdity of the situation, but it was just a test. In fact, I'm absolutely healthy. Forgive me if you can. Tears sprang from Rachel's eyes. Unable to contain her feelings, she covered her eyes with her hands and began to cry softly. At the same moment, Anthony knelt in front of his wife. None of the guests knew what would happen next and how the bride would react. Of course, Rachel forgave the man she loved, who moreover became her husband. Okay, my dear, let's forget everything, Rachel said, calming down. Later, in the midst of the holiday, the girl said that she was pregnant. Anthony was over the moon with his news. After all, yesterday the guy was single and didn't know how his fate would turn out. And now he's married and soon will become a father. In his marriage with Rachel, Anthony, to the great joy of his grandfather, found peace of mind and family happiness. The birth of a daughter further strengthened their union, and Harold Fletcher got the opportunity to babysit his granddaughter. And yet, young man realized for himself that if you love a person, then you should not test his feelings for strength and start a relationship with deception, because life itself will put everything in its place and make its own adjustments to the life of each of us.